Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the White Company non-aligned army. In this video, we'll be talking about who White Company are, how they play, what are their strengths, weaknesses, and general faction identity, before jumping into Infinity Army to, in this case, probably go through most of the profiles that comprise the sectoral. As always, if you would like to request a faction focus or other video topic, I do take requests from channel supporters either through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below or from channel members. This request comes from channel member Jar Jar, although I note they have a picture of Alexander Warrior Jar as their profile picture, which marks them as a person of good taste. Now, normally, at this part of the video, I would give you the sell for a faction before talking about maybe why we need to moderate that opinion just a little bit and think about the weaknesses. We're going to do that in this case, but I'm going to start with the sell and then kind of circle around, because the sell is a big one. Who are White Company? They're Pan-Oceania, with smoke and hacking. Wow, that sounds like the perfect faction. And okay, look, yes, there is some stuff that's very appealing there, but let's just talk first about the limitations, then jump back to all of that really good stuff, because there are some significant limitations in White Company. And easily the most sort of common of those that you will encounter, at least in N4 as you build White Company lists, is that it's very easy to build White Co lists that are just single wound with virtually no armor, and that's kind of them as a faction. They do have some heavy infantry, they do have some models with some armor, they absolutely do have a tag, for example, but White Company lists tend to lean toward relatively limited redundancy, relatively few additional wounds. You have to really force those things into a list, and so if you just build a White Co list that's all of the cool stuff, it's just all of the Pan-Oceania but with smoke and hacking, you will end up with a list that is fragile. Now, you can absolutely play around fragility, but it's something you have to be aware of going in. That you're either going to end up with lists that are a little bit like this, or you're going to end up with lists that have to make some sacrifices to compensate for that weakness and be more well-rounded in terms of durability. It's also worth noting that although White Company absolutely does have an interesting and solid info warnet game, they're not one of the greats. Compared to basically all Pan-Oceania factions, yes, absolutely. They can do things with hacking that Pan-Oceania can't dream of. They have access to multiple serviceable pitches, they have access to Whip 15 hackers, which technically Pano does, but a Danavas and a Deva are not in the same league in terms of utility. There are okay killer hackers, but it's kind of in the KHDs that we start to see the limitations of what White Company can do. Really, there are very limited KHD selections, and there are no apex predator hackers in White Company. You can build a good InfoWar list, but it's difficult to push past good into truly powerful. White Company has good InfoWar. They don't have truly great InfoWar that would make them the kind of fantasy you're maybe looking for if you're a Pan-Oceania player that wants to experience truly great hacking. They just have hacking as a surprisingly solid and valuable supplement to that kind of more Pan-Oceanian gameplay style. Similarly, yes, they have smoke, it's not that much smoke. You can have usually 2 models with smoke in a list because you have Varangian guards and their AVA2, and that's all of the smoke you have. Now, some is absolutely more than none, but if you want to play a lots of smoke up the guts kind of list, you will need to look elsewhere, because just 2 dudes with smoke does not facilitate an entire game plan around smoke. It's a very useful supplementary tool. You'll be able to block line of sight occasionally, do some useful things. You'll be able to absolutely do some high quality smoke shooting. But this is not, for example, a Toha list with total visibility control. So, although White Company absolutely is Pano with smoke and hacking, moderate your expectations about both the smoke and the hacking. And so, with those important caveats, guys, White Company is Pan-Oceania with smoke and hacking. And so if you are a Pan-Oceanian player and you are looking to maybe make a few moderate purchases, a little bit of creative proxying, but buy a few things, you can really branch out from Pan-Oceania into this mercenary company and get just a taste of many of the things that perhaps you are missing with the faction that you have chosen. And although really we have no idea what N5 is going to be like, if you are a Pan-Oceanian player that is looking at N5 being like, well, the game is going to change, we know that White Company is going to be in N5. We have no reason to believe that the roster will change really significantly, because ultimately it's limited enough that it would be weird, basically, for it to contract, for example. And among other things, it includes Lanai and a few of the mercenary pieces that are missing from the vanilla Panoceania roster that we've seen in N5. And so if you are willing to maybe make a couple of very small purchases, perhaps use some of those Fennec, Kestrel Colonial Force models that you've purchased, for example, it's an interesting expansion point from Panoceania, in particular Panoceania. Like, if I was a Yuching player, I would not be like, oh, I just have to buy a whole bunch of miniatures to play Whiteco. But if you're a Panoceania player, it's a very interesting and natural expansion, and might be a fun one to dabble with, both at the end of N4 and the beginning of N5. And you do get quite a lot of interesting stuff added to the faction. The hacking is good. Like, with 15 hackers with pitches, like actual pitches, you get access to white noise, you get access to serviceable killer hackers, you have those Panoceanian remotes that are good quality and are repeaters that you can use and have like a real boy info war game. You have, usual Panoceanian good quality mimetism, MSV1, MSV2, Nisseys are here, and if you're a long-term Panoceania player, like if you predate Svalaheimer and you've been sitting there looking at Nisseys for 5 years being like, really like to smoke shoot with those, this is the faction that you can do that in. You can even link them, although you could just as easily run them solo. You've got Kahos, and we know how good Kahos are, etc. The smoke is Fizz 14, so as much as it's limited to 2 troopers, you're going to be pretty good at just getting out there to do the things that you want with it. And there's basically just a bunch of solid primo pieces that mix close assault with good, if fragile, gunfighting. The Kaho really is kind of the crux there. You have Panoceanian solid style cores and Harises to set up with, so you can either go a full total availability Fusilier core if that's your comfort zone. You can splash some stuff in as a wild card. You can run a surprisingly versatile number of 2x3 teams if you wanted to. So you get 1 core and 1 Harise, but you can do the 2x3 configuration, and there are some good options for that. You also, just as a nice sort of splash point, means that you can use Yuching and doctors and engineers. So even though this is Panoceania, you are, yes, whip 13 on your doctors and engineers. Only ballistic skill 11, but that's fine on your doctors and engineers. So there are a bunch of these like little nice edge cases that come with, nominally, a very Panoceanian core identity. Now, you pay for that in the way that I said that you do, right? You don't have access to any Panoceanian tags. You don't have access to the better quality Panoceanian heavy infantry. We're dealing with pretty average HI here. That's part of where the fragility comes from. But there's not a lot of dead air in the faction. There are a small number of profiles that are perhaps slightly overcosted, or too fairly costed. Nokken, for example, we won't really cover when we get into the army section. But the overall model by model strength and how the faction comes together entirely is just very good, solid, mixed Panoceanian stuff with basically every capability that you might want to do basically any mission, except the ones that require lots of heavy infantry. So basically just Frostbite, and you can absolutely build a Whiteco list for Frostbite, but it's not where the faction's strength necessarily lies, and that's just something that you have to accommodate. If you're comfortable with that, if you're comfortable either stretching a little bit away from all of the very nicest tools and taking some slightly more mid pieces in order to have durability in the faction, or just being like, nope, look, we're going to be a little fragile, but everything we have is high quality, Whiteco is a fantastic Panoceanian offshoot into non-aligned armies. If you're a Svalaheimer player in particular, I would say they are a very natural expansion if you wanted to just try a few slightly different things. But almost any Panoceanian player should find something to really like in terms of stuff that you don't have access to at home, but do by dipping your toes into non-aligned armies. Now, from here, as usual, we're going to jump into Infinity Army. We're going to go through quite a lot of the profiles that are available to White Company. We will not be talking about Chaxa Longarms, and we won't be talking about Nokken, but that's like kind of close to the limit of things that don't really have much of a place. Oh, and blockers. Blockers are also no good in this sectoral. But almost everything else has some merit. And so if you are a White Company player and I skip over something that you think I should have mentioned, you're absolutely right. I should have mentioned it, and I only have so much time in these videos. So as usual, we are hitting the high notes, but there is plenty to explore if you are moving through, particularly the nuances of Whiteco. Starting with the obvious and good stuff though, hey, it's Fusiliers and they are availability total. Now, if you are a Pan-Oceanian player, certainly in N4 you will be very familiar with how to run these as a core kind of castle link. It's a classic combination. You will have your Fusilier Lieutenant, a Decoy Lieutenant, a Paramedic, a multi-sniper or missile launcher, and then maybe one other of your choice, and that gives you just a solid castle for not too many points, making good use of the ballistic skill 12 of Fusiliers. It's cheap and it gives you tons of points for other stuff in the army, and there are some good quality, there is a very good quality NCO that you have available, so there's nothing wrong with a Fusilier Lieutenant. Now, there are a bunch of things that Whiteco can choose to add to a Fusilier link, but nothing that will retain link purity, which in N4 is a big deal. In N5, probably not so much. In fact, definitely not so much, because we've seen the N5 Fireteam rules at time of recording this video. So in N5, we might be much more flexible with our wildcards. The payoff will still be relatively low because N5 has changed how link teams work, but splashing in, for example, an Orc Flareback or a Hideout MSV2 Sniper, that works well in N4, and it will continue to work basically exactly the same way in N5 because of how the bonuses change. You won't have Sixth Sense, but you'll have pretty much everything else that you would have, which means that a Whiteco player in N4 is not going to see their core castle reduced significantly moving between editions. Now, in terms of those wildcards, if you are doing a core Firebase kind of link, yep, it is usually going to be either a Hideout, which we'll talk about, MSV2 Sniper, or an Orc with gun of your choice. But I would like to kind of shout out other ways to run the Fusilier core, and there are sort of two that I would note. The first is, and this is more of a Varuna thing, where the defenses are a little bit more spread out across other troops, but I do have a soft spot for a Fusilier link that uses a heavy machine gun. It's a build your own BS-15 HRMC-ish kind of piece. There is nothing wrong with Burst 5 BS-15, and you can splash some other stuff in there as well because it's a cheaper SWC weapon. And Whiteco is different to Vanilla Pan-Oceanic because it has some actual asymmetric play. You can play very solid guided missile play in Whiteco, for example, but there is nothing wrong with a Fusilier core-linked grenade launcher because, again, ballistic skill 12 up to 15, spec firing on 9s can absolutely win certain games. So that is a configuration for a pure Fusilier core that I personally like. Have not played it in Whiteco, have played it in Varuna. Yes, it is better suited to Varuna, but you could incorporate it into a Whiteco game. Now, the other very useful way to run Fusiliers is either as a Haris or three-person core, just as the basis of that kind, like a little three-person team. And that will usually start with something like a Fusilier Paramedic, who is there to get everyone back up in the rest of the link. And that's where we start making sort of like more aggressive use of wildcards. Now, this is not a link that will translate to N5 because we're looking at something like, for example, a Fusilier and a CSU, right? CSU has a shotgun or a nanopulsar, breaker rifle, that kind of weapon. In N4, the Specialist Operative Rifle Light Shotgun is a very attractive choice. In N5, we might be thinking about any of the nanopulsar profiles. The Breaker Rifle Nanopulsar +1 burst isn't a specialist, but will certainly be very solid in N5, I would expect. And then, having spent all of 14 points on 2 Link Troopers, we then just add in 1 or 2 good wildcards. So one option would be something like an Orc, HMG, or Fwebeck as a gun, and then Lanai or Shona Carano, both of whom can wildcard in Whiteco. Or a more simple and self-contained 3-person Haris team, John Hawkwood. John Hawkwood is one of the better guns in the faction, and he is a model that has at least some nominal resiliency. We'll cover him in a bit. So you can have something like Hawkwood, CSU, and a Paramedic Fusilier, and the Fusilier is there as the glue. Now, that is a link that will not work the same way in N5, because in N5, it's just, in a Fusilier link team, it's the number of Fusiliers that you have that counts. So we will need to change out the CSU, assuming they don't count as Fusiliers. We'll need to change out the CSU for another Fusilier, and that frankly will be fine. 2 Fusiliers and Hawkwood will be a very serviceable little Haris core or 3-person core kind of fire team. But either way, N4 or N5, kind of regardless of how you are playing White Co and how you're configuring your links, the Fusilier will often be the basis of one or more of your links in this sectoral, and they are good in all of the ways that Pan-Oceanian players will be able to tell you, because Ballistic Skill 12 is just a better Ballistic Skill than Ballistic Skill 11. Now, from Fusiliers and CSU, our very light infantry, we can absolutely form heavy infantry links out of Orc troops and Jujaks. Now, there's really no way to sugarcoat it. Look, one orc is fine. Multiple orcs is, even though you can absolutely run a 5-person pain train, the orc pain train is not a thing in Infinity N4. That may well change in N5, but the profiles that orcs have access to, the way they are statted, etc., there is absolutely nothing at all wrong with BS14 Armor 4, but there is no paramedic. The only orc specialist is a hacker, and is a Whip 12 hacker, and Jujaks don't count as orcs, so there's no mixing of this particular link. You can put multiple in there, but if you're not doing a Haris in N4, where the composition bonuses aren't important, where we're mixing orc and Jujak, and that's fine, it's going to be very awkward in N5 unless one or the other picks up kind of fire team keywords. And so, even though orcs can comfortably join Fusilier fire teams, if we're looking at a HI team in White Company, it's usually going to be a 3-person team, it's usually going to be orc troops. Now, the good thing about this as a fire team is that from an orc or Jujak base, we can add some kind of interesting elements. In particular, if you want to link Svalaheimer Nisses, if you want to live the dream of a linked Svalaheimer Nisse with smoke shooting, it's kind of got to be with an Orc or a Jujak, and there are plenty of profiles that basically, well, okay, in terms of profiles that we're going to want from Svalaheimer, please, for the love of God, do not pay 30 points for an MSV2 Mimetism combi rifle paramedic, right? But the multi-sniper and the HMG are both appealing profiles. Yes, single wound, armor 3, but very single wound, but this is a Ballistic Skill 13, linkable MSV2, Mimetism 3. There is not a lot of stuff in the game that is better at theoretically smoke shooting than a Nisse, and the only place to do it, oh, by the way, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. I don't know how it's pronounced, and I wait for the comments to correct me. There is not much that's going to be better at smoke shooting, and only in White Co can a Svalaheimer Nisse smoke shoot. Orc fire teams and Jujak fire teams, right, it's the same team, are also the only place that we can link a Blade Ops in White Company. Now, in every Pan-Oceania sectoral that can access these troopers in N4, they are one of the best models that you can possibly have, because everywhere else, or almost everywhere else, you can see these things duoing with higher value pieces, stuff like remotes, stuff like tags, where the fact that they are a 24-point engineer tactical awareness model is just absolutely premium. Not so much in White Company, but there is still nothing wrong with linking a Blade Ops with a little Harry's team that's going to be on the field. It's still a 24-point tactical awareness model that is a Whip 12 admittedly specialist, but it is a significant restriction that you can only link a Blade Ox with an Orc or a Jujak. So there is nothing wrong with a link team duo Haris or even smaller core that starts with one Orc or Jujak, adds in maybe a Nisse, maybe you use Orc as a gun piece, you have a cheaper Jujak, we add in a Blade Ops, and then we add in one of our wildcards, something like Liang Kai, for example. It's getting a little pricey, but the Jujaks especially are on the cheaper side in terms of link glue. Nothing wrong with a 26-point combi rifle heavy flamethrower, for example. That is a serviceable profile if all you need is something to begin a link team with. And if you can find a couple of extra points, going up to a breaker combi rifle gives you generally a credible anti-tag option. If you can get inside good range, make use of like 16-inch range bands to get in under the HMG, nothing wrong with a Jujak in that kind of situation. Jujaks do also have some other interesting options, but some of the stuff here, particularly for example the missile launcher, are things that I would be more looking at in N5, where it will be easier to have the critical effective +1 burst bonus. Yes, +1 discard 1 doesn't really matter. If a missile launcher hits once, that's a big deal. Something like the missile launcher might become a credible ARO piece in N5, but that's a bit more speculative. Still, as link glue, 26 to 28 points, nothing wrong with that, and then it gives us access to linked Nisses. Okay, I cracked, I looked it up, it's apparently pronounced Nisse. I'm going to do my best to do that from here on out. I wasn't too far away. Now, jumping back from our HI down to our medium infantry link, we have our Kaplan Tactical Services and Kaho link. And we're going to look at Kaplan first because this is kind of interesting. Now, this is basically just going to be a Haris, but you might choose to run it as maybe a 4-person core in N4 just for 6 cents because of some of the, particularly this is a place where wildcards might find an interesting home. Now, you need at least one Kaplan or Kahu to form this. And when we're talking about Kaplans, about 80% of what we're realistically talking about is the fact that for a fairly eye-watering 26 points for a single wound medium infantry dude, we get a Whip 14 Doctor, which if you are a Pan-Oceanian player coming into this faction is not something that you will have really ever had to deal with or had the opportunity to deal with in the past. Now, there are a selection of other models, yes, combi rifles, Blitzens, multi-sniper, HRL, light shotgun, Spitfire, there's an engineer, etc. All of those, not necessarily badly costed, particularly 23 points for a HRL light shotgun is not a bad weapon loadout at all, but they are very single wound, and you can find better gunfighters to put in this link, even though, yes, they are BS-12 and Mimetism. The big thing about the Kaplan is that it is a genuinely solid doctor that you can use to try and recover your genuinely squishy single wound troops that might join this link. And prime among those genuinely squishy but excellent single wound troops is the superlative Kahu special group. Now, I think collectively, as a community, we have all gotten over our oh my god, this profile is broken reaction that kind of everyone had when Svalorheimer dropped. Because yes, you look at it and this profile looks just incredible. It is Ballistic Skill 13, MSV1, Mimetism, Climbing Plus, and an NCO with access to, and usually the most common profile will be the +1 burst Feuerback, which goes up to a burst 4 Feuerback in even a 3-person team. That is a model with very good odds of winning gunfights against everything, and when it wins gunfights, because it's firing burst 4 DA rounds, it's going to mess you the hell up. Those rounds are also armor piercing, so it's a very significant threat to tags. Like, there's nothing that wants to just take a bunch of hits from a Kahu to the dome. Now, the price of all of that is that it is very, very single wound. It's not shock immune, it's armor 1, BTS 3. You lose a face-to-face, it will happen, right? You will lose a face-to-face roll at some point during a game with a Kahu, and a combi rifle will put you in the dirt. And if there's any model that is part of why I call White Company a very single wound, very average armor faction, if you build following what would often be kind of natural inclinations, it's the Kaho. Because you can take 5 of these, and if you spend a lot of SWC, that's a lot of Feuerbacks. And they are very, very good, right? The raw stats, the raw chance to win gunfight, and chance to destroy your opponent if you win gunfight, they're good big numbers. But he's armor 1 with a single wound, which is why, for example, we do things like run him with a Kahu Doctor so we can get him back up after he eats a single damage 13 shotgun template or something and falls over. Now, it is of course also absolutely possible to run Kahu as singleton pieces because they go up to be burst 3 on the Feuerback, and because they have things like Climbing Plus, which can cause them to occasionally leave link teams behind. If you have just like a singleton Kahu in addition maybe to your linked Kahu, that's fine. It's going to find a spot somewhere on the table. It's going to take some really, really good face-to-face rolls. It's probably going to win a bunch of them and do some damage, and it'll lose one eventually and fall over. At 35 points, it is sort of reasonably costed, but it does not feel reasonably costed for your opponent for all of those face-to-face rolls where it is winning, and it will win a lot of them. Now, in terms of rounding out that Kaplan Kahu link, for example, we do have access here to FTO Beast Hunters. This is where you can join the Kahu Kaplan link with a Beast Hunter FTO. It's the only place that you can, but it's 9 points. It brings some close combat. It's a mine layer, generally good. Beast Hunters, by the way, great profile, and they're in White Company, AVA 2. But it's also our segue into our wild cards. Because it's often going to be a Haris, if it's a core, it's never going to be a pure core. You're not going to run a pure core either of Kahus, that's prohibitively expensive, or of Kaplans, that's prohibitively not good enough. So what we're talking about with our Kahu Kaplan links is our go forward, do things, be cool, either 3 or 4-person teams usually, and in that kind of team, we want to add models that are interesting and versatile and valuable. We've got our Kaho shooter, we've got our Kaplan doctor. We could add a beast hunter. Okay, let's do that. But we've got more space in the team, particularly if it's a core, so we can find some space for wildcards. And one that you might choose to put in that kind of a link is Valeria Gromos. Now, she's a wildcard in Whitecoat. She can join everything. You're not usually going to put her in a core that is aiming for composition bonuses. Obviously, she would break those. But she is a linkable pitcher. She's not overcosted. She's very adequately statted. She would be lovely with some BTS, but you can't have everything. And Whip 14 hacking is Whip 14 hacking. And a linked pitcher is a linked pitcher. And part of White Company's ability to differentiate itself from Pan-Oceania is that in even a moderate InfoWar list, you will usually have a couple of ballistic skill 11 pitchers, and if you have Valeria Gromos, she will be linked. Now, that's not network projection to make the gods themselves tremble, but we can combine it with a couple of other things, and it is enough. And when you add just enough InfoWar into a list that is also doing all of these Pan-Oceanian things with linked teams, you get a pretty good end result, although, again, Armor 1, BTS 0, and 1 wound. The doctors are in lists like this for a reason. Now, in terms of other notable wildcards, and there are a bunch of notable wildcards, we also need to, we've already mentioned, but we'll revisit Hideout Special Support Group. There are realistically 2 profiles here that we are particularly interested in. The first is the MSV2 Multi-Sniper. Now, unlike Invincibles, and of course unlike all of Pan-Oceania, we have access to serviceable smoke grenades in White Company, which means that if we wanted to do some smoke shooting, we can do that in this faction. If there is a tag on Aero, if there is a total reaction bot on Aero, and in N5, if there's basically anything not in a 5-person pure link on Aero, because of how access to N5 Sixth Sense is going to be much more heavily gated, smoke shooting is good. And you can very, very ably smoke shoot with a hideout. Now, in a link of Fusiliers, it's going to be kind of best case scenario, burst 4, ballistic skill 14, firing its multi-sniper. But that is very serviceable. And at 1.5 SWC and 33 points, you should be able to find space for that in a list if you particularly want to. The other notable hideout that we will be reaching for, particularly in InfoWar lists, is the 24-point boarding shotgun KHD. Now, I like this kind of model, especially in those aggressive Haris team sort of setups. So if we're running something like, say, Kaplan Doctor, Kahu, a hideout special support group is a good addition there. Firstly, it's a no wound incapacitation heavy infantry, which means that if it goes into no wounding cap but doesn't die, you can recover it with the doctor, and the link won't break in sort of any of those circumstances. The link remains intact. You just quickly doctor the hideout back up, re-rolling thanks to the cube if you need to. But it's also a heavy infantry multi-wound effective piece with a boarding shotgun. And when you otherwise have a team of just single wound dudes, having a model that can kick open a door, take an anti-personnel mine to the face, and exchange some fire with the shotgun is just very useful in terms of just being a good addition to that kind of move forward link. So the hideout KHD is going to be like very usable in many White Company lists, and it's going to be your go-to KHD. But the fact that it is your go-to KHD is, to an extent, part of the limitations on InfoWar in White Company, because it's okay as far as KHDs go. It is just Whip 13, and it's BTS 0. It has no wound incapacitation, and that's really the only thing going for it. In an ideal world, if we were to polish the diamond of White Company until it absolutely shone, we would try and we would squeak into this faction a better killer hacking device. Because Lord knows there are a lot of better KHDs out there in the game, and the hideout is not going to be able to do things like go toe-to-toe with an Asuras hacker, for example. It's just not going to be able to take that fight in almost any universe. If you get things absolutely perfect and you get the jump on her before she gets a firewall up, you can potentially take that fight, but even then it's not ideal. And if an anathematic is on the table, you are not even going to see it until it appears and blows your brains out. And that's fine, right? White Company is still very, very solid, but you have to be aware that there is a strict high watermark to how far you can push InfoWar. And you can, like you put in Danavas, we'll talk about them for sure, and we have maybe Valeria Gromos, that's our network projection. We could even potentially add a Guilang if we felt like overpaying for something. And then we round that out with a hideout, and we have midfield repeaters, good repeater projection, multiple whip 14 and 15 regular hackers, a whip 13 KHD, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. That is solid. But it's just solid. And if you are a Pan-Oceanian player, it is better hacking than you have access to basically anywhere in your entire faction and all of its sectorals. But measured against the absolute maximal power the game has to offer, it's a 7 out of 10. That's still really nice to have into a list, particularly slotting into a list without necessarily having to flex too hard, but be aware of those limitations. All of this is a very long way of saying the hideout is good and you should use it in lists. Now, our next very notable wildcard piece is John Hawkwood. John Hawkwood is the captain of White Company. It is his mercenary company. We can see its logo there on his logo. And John is a piece that I have mixed opinions about, but who should be on your radar. Mixed opinions because he's real expensive. He is not cheap. Bare minimum 40 points for this man. And for that we get a no winning capacitation BS13 mimetism shooter. He's worse at winning face-to-face rolls than a Kaho, but he has no winning capacitation. He has shock immunity, he has armor 3 and BTS 6, so he's pretty much heavy infantry as far as durability goes. And his weapon options allow you to choose between either a Red Fury, very solid, have to contemplate the fact that it's going to be damage 13, which is just going to spang off some of the heaviest stuff in the game, or on the exact opposite end of the scale, a K1 marksman rifle. Now, either of these is fine, and you are not just paying 1 SWC for the Red Fury, which is totally okay. The K1 marksman rifle is particularly interesting to me. It costs pretty much exactly the same. K1 is a very, very good ammunition type a lot of the time. Sometimes it's just effectively damage 14. Sometimes it's effectively damage 13, right? You're shooting an enemy armor 0 Beast Hunter, it is just worse than the Red Fury because it doesn't have shock and has lower burst. But as soon as you're shooting against something even that's armor 2, damage 13 plus K1 starts looking pretty good. And if you draw bead on like a tag, hot damn, you could not ask for a better weapon. Now, in any other faction, that would probably be a very, very big deal, but we have Kaho here, and Kaho, or Nisei snipers, smoke shooting, like, Whiteco does not struggle to put tags in the dirt, whether it is armor piercing or double action, multi-sniper, MSV, potentially mimetism, smoke shooting, like, tags do not like that at all. You can put down the avatar in this list. Or we have John Hawkwood, or we have the Fware bag. You're not hurting for ways to put a heavily armored piece in the dirt. But I do nevertheless like the K1 marksman rifle, and being 0 SWC is going to matter, particularly if we're trying to fit in both guns and hacking and missiles. 0 SWC is a very nice luxury. Now, that luxury comes at a whopping actual points cost, because 40 to 45 points is just a lot. It is a large portion of your list, so you can't always include him, but particularly in a Haris team, like that Haris team that I mentioned, Fusilier Paramedic, CSU, Special Operative usually, and then Hawkwood, whether it's the chain of command or just a K1 marksman dude, will serve you well. He has decent martial arts abilities, but a large part of why he is so expensive is that he basically has very close to the worst kind of CC bloat, right? CC 22 and martial arts 1 and a monofilament weapon, kind of ironically, is a combination of all of the stuff that is just not what you quite want to rely on, and absolutely he is not a CC expert. He has just enough close combat to make an enemy expert feel maybe a little bit uncertain walking into melee with him, and if he does get into close combat with a tag, for example, yes, you will probably eventually put it in the dirt, but he's only, best case scenario, he's rolling +2 on his die and imposing a small penalty to the enemy. Like, it's better than being just CC 20 with no other skills, but it's not much better, and it is pushing like probably 4 or 5 points onto his profile, which is part of why he is so damn expensive. Very solid piece, and of course, obviously the namesake, like the captain of the mercenary company, someone that if you're into the theme of the list rather than playing it purely mechanically, is worth having in the back pocket. But otherwise, definitely a careful consideration, but a very solid option if you are able to just scrape together those points to afford him. Now, just to cover a couple more nominal wildcards, we have Shona Carano, who at 27 points, look, she's Lankai at home, but Lankai is a character, and you can only have one of him, and sometimes you want more than one person that is actually really good at CC. I am ultimately mixed on Shona Carano because, unlike Lankai, she is fundamentally fairly costed. 27 points for what you get. If she gets into CC with something, that is not a natural born warrior, martial artist, etc., that will just beat her in a fight, because those do exist in N4. She will absolutely crank it. Like, there is not a lot that does more damage than her with her explosive close combat weapon with CCAP, right? Getting into close combat, that sword will decapitate a tag. But at 27 points, you got to pay the points to make that work. She's expensive. But if you want multiple close assault pieces after you've taken Len Kai, nothing wrong with taking her. And it is definitely worth noting that looking forward to N5, that martial arts 4, that's a real big deal because that's proper +1 burst. And she's not going to be in a situation anymore where Natural Born Warrior just super hard counters her, which means she genuinely has a pretty solid chance of fighting basically anything. And if she connects with even a single of her 2 die, and she could easily hit with 2 of her 2 die because it's martial arts level 4, she will just absolutely crank. The Nanopulsar is also just a nice thing to note moving into the next edition because it's not a shotgun, it's an actual template. And those are going to be a little more valuable since in N5 we expect, based on early quick start rule weapon profiles, that shotguns are maybe not quite being the same as they were in N4 with that easy access to templates. Now, while Shona is Lankai at home, Lankai is just Lankai. I feel like this man needs no introduction. He is one of the best missiles in the entire game. He is the cheapest model that I would qualify as his own self-contained rapid offensive unit because he forward deploys, and with Impetuous and Super Jump he moves hella fast. He is much, much faster than 4-4 looks because of that initial forward deployment plus Impetuous, and if he gets in on you, he's going to give you a terrible day. He has both a chain rifle and a light shotgun and a flash pulse for some reason. He is not shock immune, but he does have no wound in cap and mimetism. Martial arts 4, explosive close combat weapon, berserk, CC23, just a missile, just a par excellence missile. I would go as far as to say that, look, you should probably just put him in every White Company list. There might be some exceptions, but I don't know what they are. Even if he just kind of hangs out 4 inches outside the DZ, waiting for his moment, and your opponent does not go anywhere near that space because they don't want to deal with Lankai, that's almost a worthwhile investment at how cheap he is. Probably just put him in every single list. And because he is part of White Company's roster, and I don't hugely expect the sectoral rosters to change, he's probably a pretty safe bet for if you are looking for your Lankai fix in N5 and you're like a vanilla Pan-Oceania player, you just consider White Company because here he is, along with all of your other friends. You missed them, and they missed you, and they're so, so good, and Martial Arts 4 will just mean he's probably better in N5. He's not even going to suffer particularly from the light shotgun nerf because he's got a chain rifle. We will, of course, see, like, profiles can change, etc., but he's a hell of a piece. I really can't undersell him. Put him in your lists. Now, while Leng Kai straddles the line between wildcard and independent operator because you can put him in a list, but he's so good just running forward as a missile, we now get into the true independent kind of pieces, and I think that starts with the Danavas, who is a true independent piece because she's forced to be. I would love to link her. You can link her in OSS, for example, but no, not here in White Company, and that is essential for balance purposes, because they're really good linked. The Danavas is just one of the best hackers in the game for the points cost. She's 22 points, she comes with a pitcher, she's whip 15, she's got an upgraded Oblivion profile, she's just really, really solid. Can't fight her way out of a wet paper bag, she's Ballistic Skill 11, and that will matter when you're shooting pitches from time to time, but she's a hacking device plus with willpower 15. For me, once you get to willpower 14, I am willing to contemplate guided missiles as an offensive, like primary offensive tool. But whip 15 and whip 16 is where it's like starts to be like, nope, I can absolutely guide it as one of the first choices, like in terms of offensive options. And whip 15 on hackers is a very rare coin. Whip 16 is almost unknown. Whip 17 is technically doable, but very difficult. and requires great sacrifice. So that means that for most armies, Whip 15 is still above the high water mark, and having access to it in a sectoral that is otherwise Pan-Oceania coded is a huge deal. Probably put her in most of your lists. You can only take one, but she's very, very good. And at only 22 points, you should be able to afford her in most of your lists. Next up on our independent operators list, we have Varangian Guards, and yes, Varangian Guards can duo. You may choose to begin the game with them duoed just so that they can benefit from cover against an early attack, for example. But realistically, Varangian Guards, they are your only source of smoke. You will probably want them split up, and frankly, you'll probably want them to be able to use impetuous orders, particularly if you are planning on just using them initially to facilitate shooting through smoke at your enemies. You really want to be using that impetuous order to just have them in a nice safe space where they will run from a safe spot to another safe spot and then use their impetuous order to throw smoke on 17s. Impetuous in N4 is very predictable. We have no idea how it will change in N5. Some of the rules will be denested, but otherwise I have no idea. But assuming it remains even remotely similar, you will want to use them in a similar way. You use that smoke to facilitate other plays, and if you're going to do that, they may as well be impetuous, at least from your first active turn onwards, because free orders is free orders. In terms of the rest of the package, I have spoken about Varangian Guard previously and at length. I consider them significantly overrated, but smoke is smoke, and if you want smoke in White Cove, Varangian Guards are where it's at. Now, you will absolutely have multiple better close combat options if you want them in a list. Hell, the Guija is a better close combat option by a significant margin than Varangian Guards, although you would expect it to be at like 70 points more expensive. But the overall point remains the same. You want to use Varangian Guards not as like berserking offensive pieces. These are not Galwegians. You use these as support and defensive elements. Get them forward into positions where they can hold things off, use the fact that they are armor 2 with Dogged, and use the fact that they throw smoke as their primary attributes. If they get a melee kill, fantastic, good for you, but I would be saving my Varangian Guard for both defensive work and smoke throwing, because that's what they offer that you otherwise don't necessarily get easy access to in the faction. Next up on this list I have written myself is... it's Squealangs. Alright, look, we've covered this in the past. They're not bad, but they are aggressively fair. The thing about Guilangs is that no matter what profile you take, you will be paying for something that you're not using. Are you taking anything except the hacking profile? Well, you're overpaying for Whip 14. Are you taking the hacking profile? Well, then you're overpaying for your multispectral visor level 1. Do you want to do shooting with them? Bad news, you've paid for Whip 12 and Whip 14 and Fizz 12, and you are ballistic skill 11. Inevitably, in any role you put them in, Guilang will have some small inefficiency that makes me personally kind of dislike them, but this is a faction that has access to some pretty good hacking, and there is something absolutely to be said for the 27, good lord, 27-point Mind Layer profile. Half an SWC, 27 points, you are making some use, like Boarding Shotgun is a nice weapon in N4 and will be okay in N5. You do have Mimetism and a Multispectral Visor, you can go and pretend to be a Libertos at least a little bit. The main thing is, just firstly, we are a fragile faction some of the time, and so defense that insulates us particularly out into the midfield to close off certain approaches or disincentivize certain approaches, excellent. I'll have some of that, please. And from time to time, the ability to choose rather than laying a shock mine and instead laying a deployable repeater is a really, really big deal. Now, is this thing 10 points more expensive and kind of objectively worse than a Masai Moran? Yes, but Masai Morans are one of the best profiles in the game. They are unique and powerful. 10 points more expensive is what we're paying for an interesting capability that you just otherwise wouldn't necessarily have. If you want to do offensive hacking plays, also, it's a deployable repeater. You can sneak forward with the Guilang. If you get discovered, you can recamouflage, keep moving. It's going to be order intensive, but it is another kind of network projection. And so if you can scrape together the 27 points, the Guilang Mind Layer is a piece that is worth being aware of, even if I don't personally recommend them. There are absolutely people who do. There are Guilang Tragics out there. Lord knows I have plenty of my own profiles that I just really like, even though they are not good, and there are people for who Guilang is that profile. It's a pet profile, they've had great work out of them, and I'm not surprised by that. Because the thing about the Guilang is that even though it will almost always be overcosted, it will also almost always at least have a floor that is not bad, because you have all of these damn tools that you're paying for. And so even though, for example, the mine layer is 27 points and is going to almost always perform about as well as a 22 or 23 point model, it will almost always perform about as well as a 22 or 23 point model, and there are places in lists for that. Now, if you want to go even further into stuff like network projection, we also have access to, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Pan-Oceanian suite of ARM bots and all of the usual remotes, which are, look, fallen from grace, particularly in the case of the Peacemaker, but they are elements that are worth considering and being aware of. 24 points for the heavy shotgun Peacemaker is kind of a tragedy. It got a significant points increase. It's like you cannot increase a model's points cost by a 20% markup and expect it to survive particularly well. But for all of that, the Peacemaker is good ablative defense, right? It carries that Oxbot. The Oxbot can deny your opponent some space, can force a flamethrower trade, soak up orders, etc. And the Peacemaker itself has a heavy shotgun, and the Peacemaker is a forward deploying repeater. And if you have engineers, for example, a Blade Ops, then it is recoverable thanks to remote presence, structure, etc. Now, I would personally go as far as to say that the 4-point cost increase to the Peacemaker hurt White Company almost more than it hurt any Pan-Oceanian faction, because Pan-Oceanian factions tend to have other ways to make up that delta, but Whiteco likes Peacemakers because Peacemakers are really good at giving you that insulation that gives you a first turn, because it's just 2 wounds that are separate and distinct in the midfield that your opponent has to push through, and that means that if you are running a fragile Whiteco army, having just a couple of ablative pieces, particularly the Oxbot, is just really nice in giving you that comfort to get that first turn and get the game going the way that you want it to go. And at 24 points, they are a much harder sell, but they do synergize very nicely with what the faction has going on. Now, their sister profile, the Bulleteer, is a little bit less applicable in Whiteco than it is, for example, in Neoterra, just because there's no duos for it. If we use it in Whiteco, it is cursed to be a solo piece that you can try and support, etc. But look, 26 points and 1 SWC for a Mimetism 6 Ballistic Skill 12 Spitfire has some merit, and they're also like fantastic models, and I have a soft spot for them. They are my Guilang. They are absolutely not an every time kind of piece, just like the Peacemaker. Really can't recommend these in lots and lots of lists, but if you're running some hacking, you want a little bit of extra network projection, and you want your remotes to actually do something, you can do worse than a Bulleteer Spitfire, particularly if you're trying to run lean on SWC, and maybe something like Hawkwood is a touch too expensive. Now, just rounding out a few of our more independent pieces, Tiger Soldiers. Now, Tiger Soldiers are a little bit like Guilangs in that they are fundamentally fairly costed, because there is always going to be maybe something that you are slightly overpaying for. Whip 14 in particular on these, you are rarely going to be taking the Tiger Soldier Hacker. 34 points is a little eye-watering, but they are very rare levels of shooting capable on a jump troop. At Ballistic Skill 13 with Mimetism, you will not often find a jump troop that can fire that well, and you have access to a selection of solid profiles. Combi Rifle and Light Flamethrower is one of the most common weapon loadouts, but you also have access to Spitfires, and a Tiger Soldier, if you are willing to splash on it and you have the SWC spare. Again, probably not in most lists, but it's worth kind of thinking about in terms of where the faction can expand to. One of the nice things about the Tiger Soldier Spitfire is that if it flubs its landing roll, well, you have a Mimetism 3 Ballistic Skill 13 Spitfire in your deployment zone, which is a totally serviceable piece to try to use. They are, nevertheless, inevitably, a bit like the Guilang, just a touch challenging to get their points worth of performance out of. Much like the Guilang will almost always perform about as well as a 23-point model, the Tiger Soldier is very often going to perform as well as a 24 to 30-point model, despite the fact that they cost 28 to 34 points. But all of the various little bits of upstatting that you are paying for do give you a piece that occasionally will crack open a game. Now, last on the list of cool independent operators that I wanted to talk about, we do have to mention the Guija, and the Guija offers and operates in a surprisingly unique niche in White Company. Now, obviously, the Guija is a Yuqing tag. Its home is in Yuqing sectorals. It is in it's in vanilla and at least 2 Yuqing sectorals. It's not available in ISS. But definitely in Invincible Army, and usually in White Banner, you will not take the Guija because the Blue Wolf exists, and the Blue Wolf is really, really solid. But in White Company, no such competition exists, and the Guija begins to emerge as a well, maybe I'm actually totally okay with what we're getting here. Now, the Guija does have the curse of the tag that is paying for extra stuff that it won't always use. In line behind, basically most of the other Yuching stuff that is in this sectoral. But you can kind of afford to look past that because ultimately it is your only main battle tag. And although there is absolutely a tension between the unique kit that the Guija has that differentiates it, for example, from a lizard, and its role as a main battle tag, right? Like it has martial arts and a DACCW and a good close combat score and super jump. Super jump is awesome. All of that martial arts stuff can be challenging to use on a tag because a tag is fundamentally a fire support platform, right? Most of the time, how you will be using a piece like this is not in a close assault capacity, because if your opponent has literally any hacking left at all, then the barest, meanest possible info war presents an existential threat to a piece like a tag. You get possessed in your active turn running this thing forward, and your opponent just climbs onto a wall and leaves your tag there, maybe walks into close combat, and you're screwed. And so natively, right, the way that we will generally use main battle tags is as fire support, suppression, using that nice durable piece to do like a little bit of ARO work potentially, but mostly put down things that are on Overwatch. Firstly, well, okay, obviously in White Company, yes, we do have many other things that can do that kind of suppression work, but often they will be fragile. A Guija is not. A Guija can afford to lose some face-to-face rolls and be totally fine. But then that fire support role is a little bit in tension with the martial arts. And given that the martial arts and super jump are adding about 10 points to a Guija's price tag, because this model would absolutely cost about 72 points if it didn't have either of those rules, Super Jump is comprising the majority of that, and Super Jump is awesome, especially late N4 updates that have enabled you to measure the top of the silhouette. The Guija is very mobile, and it's kind of worth just bearing in mind that although most of the time we will use the Guija in a close assault, not in a close assault, in a fire support role, in those games where the close assault comes up, it's super awesome. It's not necessarily efficient. This is an 82-point model, but the fact that you can choose to use your mobility to gap close, right, in those moments where you judge that it is safe to do so or necessary to do so, the enemy hacking network is neutralized, your opponent has extended beyond their hacking network, they're Ariadne and they don't have a hacking network. The fact that the Guija can operate perfectly fine in HMG range bands, but then push forward and get into CC, and it is absolutely good and durable enough in CC that against any non-CC expert, and even because of the durability, some CC experts, it can push its way through a fight. And with a +1 damage multi-heavy flamethrower, you can even close in and present a reasonably solid fork, because the Guija is so durable that when it walks into close combat, and your opponent is like, oh well, I will shoot you, and you template me, and I will trade. Like a combi rifle at burst 2, for example, shooting back at a Guija even without cover is probably going to spang and might do a wound at most before the flamethrower burns the model to death. That wound on a Guija, if you take it at all, is eminently tolerable. And that means that although you should never have your primary game plan be, ah yes, the Guija will break their lines, the fact that especially late in the game when a situation is messy, perhaps your opponent has a compass some midfield objectives, they've moved in but then they've hunkered everything down, the fact that you can assault a null deployed position with a Guija if you need to, provided you neutralize any hacking defense, is really, really cool. Now, much like the Guilang, much like the Tiger Soldier, yep, you're probably overpaying by about 4 points for this tag a lot of the time. But unlike those two other pieces, in those games, in those moments where you make full use of the Guija's kit, it is absolutely worth 82 points. I personally have something of a soft spot for making the Guija my lieutenant, and I have run that in White Company. And that's pretty much off the back of, if the 82-point model dies, I probably lose anyway. So let's just get a free order, and I will simply not have the Guija die before I have won the game. That is, it absolutely has to be said, a slightly higher risk, higher reward kind of play. But if you have the 2SWC, it costs no extra points to make the Guija your lieutenant, and it does give you a free order. I like in N4 lieutenant tags, no idea if that will be true in N5. And if I am taking a lieutenant Guija, I'm probably not taking a Kaho because I have plans for that LT order. And that kind of works as well, because frankly, if I am taking a Guija, I am not necessarily likely to have points for a Kaho. Now, That has been a surprisingly exhaustive look at the profiles available to White Company, and that is because a lot of the profiles available to White Company are eminently usable. Yes, I do welcome the responses in the comments telling me that I have committed sacrilege by not at least glancing at Tao Wu, for example, or Kunai ninjas. But in terms of both meat and potatoes and technical pieces, White Company really does enjoy, like, obviously some restrictions, but a broadly wide array of options that can help inform what goes into a list. And speaking of lists, behold, a list. This is my attempt at what I would call kind of generic good stuff, White Company, a few small flexes, but nothing I would say that is really fundamentally questionable. It is using the kind of things that I like, and as a result, I would say you can make the argument that the defense is a little thin, and I think that is a reasonable complaint, and it's kind of one of the issues that you may have to deal with from time to time with White Company. If you wanted to run White Company with just a Fusilier defensive core, maybe with a Hideout, you would not be doing the wrong thing by doing so. And frankly, it's probably where I would recommend that you maybe start the faction if you are just jumping there from Pan-Oceania, for example. But this version of the list showcases many of the things that I personally like, so it's kind of built a little bit more for fun than necessarily for deep optimization, although the list of tools that you have access to is deep and strong. So we're starting with a 4-person fire team. And this is a Kaplan Kaho fire team. So we have a Kaho Feuerback NCO, a Kaplan Doctor. Then we are wildcarding in 2 troopers. So this will be a 4-person fire team core, enough to get 6 cents. And in that vein, we're wildcarding in 2 hackers. We're adding in our Hideout and Valeria Gromos. So this gives us, firstly, the Hideout gives us our door kicking. If he takes a wound, like say for example, disarming a mine the hard way, we can recover him with the Kaplan Doctor without breaking the link. And then Gromos is of course Gromos, both all of the usual hacking suite and a linked picture. We've then got a Clipper Dronbot and a Danavas hacker. So just immediately in these first 6 models, we've got Whip 14 hacker, Whip 15 hacker, Whip 14 and Whip 15, and a killer hacker and a missile bot and multiple pitches. This is the kind of info war that you can build in White Company, and it's solid. It's good, and it's slotting kind of nicely into both an existing link team and some independent pieces. We then have 2 Varangian guards that we've sprung for the Trench Hammer upgrades. You can run the 12-point pieces. It's a little more economical, particularly if they're just being pure support. In this list, we don't have any MSV2s to smoke shoot with, although the Kaho will have 6 cents. So in extremis, you can absolutely throw some smoke and then fire with it. Mostly what your opponent will then do is dodge, and you will have a penalty, but it won't be much of a penalty, and if they're dodging, they're dodging. If they do shoot back, 6 cents will kick in, and you are as good as having an MSV2. We then have Lanai, because he's awesome. In this case, because Lanai is a wild card, we could slot him into the 5-person core, or even if we have our Varangian guard split apart, we can just duo him with a Varangian guard at the beginning of the game, just so that they all have cover, and it will help mitigate some of that first turn risk just a little bit. But otherwise, we mostly plan to use Lanai as a different kind of guided missile. Jumping into Group 2, we then have an option for a 5-person core, but realistically we are going to run this as a Haris because it's going to be the Kaho that is our core, and so it's the Haris that I mentioned, Hawkwood, Fusilier, Paramedic, and in this case we've paid 1 extra point. The CSU is not a specialist, the Fusilier is, but the CSU has a breaker rifle and a nanopulsar. The breaker rifle is particularly useful here because Hawkwood, we had the SWC spare, and because I cannot abide unspent resources if I have them, we've gone with a Red Fury over the K1 on Hawkwood, relying kind of on the Kaho hacking and close combat if we run into anything really heavy. It's going to give him higher burst, fine, just makes him a little bit more reliable. We then have 2 Fusiliers, 1 regular, 1 decoy. That's right, this is one of the first times in one of these lists that I have not just raw dogged an obvious lieutenant. Don't get me wrong, it was very tempting to just make Hawkwood the LT, but I have resisted the urge. But if you did make Hawkwood the LT, you could turn both of those Fusiliers into Fugazi Dronbots and save 6 points, which you could use on any number of things. Cut a point here and there on the Varangian, maybe on the CSU, and we would start being able to do things like upgrade the Peacemaker, which is the last model in the list, into something even more expensive. Now, as much as I mentioned several times that the 4 points to the Peacemaker really did hurt it, in this kind of a list, it is it's the only repeater that we have, and it is very useful to have that kind of repeater. It is going to be our reserve drop in most games. especially if we are going second, but even if we are going first, being able to just plop it down once you've seen where all of your opponent's stuff is in a position that can either launch a terribly dangerous attack, potentially, because it is a 6-4 repeater with a heavy shotgun and a heavy flamethrower model moving along with it, or in a defensive position where it can just hold up whatever the worst kind of attack coming your way is. Anything short of basically a bear pod, it has a good chance of stopping. If it's not a bear pod, if it's just a lighter kind of piece that's using close assault tactics, then the fact that it has a heavy flamethrower on the Oxport and a heavy shotgun on it represents pretty existential threat to most things that might cross the board. A bear pod can push through that, but is likely to be wounded along the way, and that's just how you deal with bear pods, is you just they're going to get their licks in and you just keep shooting them until they're dead. And against anything that is heavier, the fact that it is a repeater, your hacking network is prodigious. Even something like an Asura, while you have all of your hackers intact, is not necessarily going to want to just stage dive your repeater network, because she is copying 3 separate AROs back thanks to Gromos and the Danavas and the Hideout. And so in this list in particular, just the presence of that Peacemaker as our reserve drop, if we're going second or even if we're going first, adds just a nice layer of insurance that, although the defense in this list is thin, you could afford to lose any 1 or 2 pieces and still be eminently serviceable, even after the Peacemaker potentially goes down. And if it doesn't go down, it's a great piece to have. I think in this case, it rounds the list out well, and we found the 4 extra points to pay for it over the 20 points it would have cost previously. Now, that wraps up this faction focus at almost exactly an hour. As always, I do hope very much that you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Big thanks again to channel supporter Jar Jar, who made the request for the White Company faction focus. And if you are still listening at this point, I will admit quietly just now that I had a moment of literal terror as I was recording this, just wondering if I had misread and he didn't actually want White Banner instead. No, it was White Company, but I've just given myself a very small heart attack. Anyway, as always, I hope very much you'd enjoy this, and I will see you, most likely, next week for your next Infinity video.